Hi everybody, I'm Henry Badgery and welcome back for the 5th episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. Joining us today in this episode of Open Source for Business is Wenjing Chu. Wenjing has been working in open source for the past 6 years now and is currently serving on the Technology Advisory Council at the Linux Foundation. We'll be diving deep into two important initiatives that Wenjing has been working on at the Linux Foundation, and they are the Trust Over IP Foundation and LF Edge. We also covered a few really interesting topics, such as what industries have embraced open source software and what industries haven't. What are some of the biggest mistakes that companies make when either using or contributing to open source software? And what is Wenjing most excited about when it comes to the future of open source software? Hosting this episode is Eunice Chenju, the VP of Partners at Open Teams. So, if we're all ready, let's dive right in.
Wenjing, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Wenjing, we would love to get to know you a little bit on this podcast. Can you take us back and explain how you got here today?
Certainly, yeah. So open source is a fascinating phenomenon. I think a lot of us are getting to know more and more of it. But really, its history goes back much earlier to the sort of the foundational days of computing itself. In the early days, software is often open source, as we will call it today. But it actually took quite a while before what we know as a commercial software become a reality. And there's a lot of established laws and practices, etc. But open source, the concept of giving out the software in the source code form to sort of encourage experiment and innovation, it's not old, so it's not new at all. So that's been around for a long time. So like you mentioned earlier, my involvement started in open source about 6 years ago. But my own experience, I think I want to share with open sources, it's definitely earlier. It's in my research days when I was working on operating system. And we, without even thinking, always naturally start to work on BSD, that's the open source Unix implementation from UC Berkeley, and GNU toolchains. So we work on TCP/IP stack, and all that is all essentially open source. The more structured, or we're going to talk about Linux Foundation, for example, way of doing open source happened a bit later. But these are so myself, I started about 6 years ago. There was an effort at the time to expand the way of using open source into other industries. A way, expand from IT to additional industries that I think we think at the time that it will benefit from open source. And the first project we started was for telecom industry, networking and all that equipment. And it's very complex and expensive to develop. So the concept I think people came up was a network function virtualization. It's essentially a way to implement typical telecom equipment using software and general software based on off-the-shelf, general servers and computer equipment that we are familiar with. So that's the very beginning. And that end up into, I think later on, the organizations called LF networking. So these particular communities, OP and FV, they're still working on a lot of really interesting things to get telecom industry into that new space. So that model worked really well. So it's been expanding to many different industries as well, and including the two of the projects or communities that we'll talk about today.
Wow.
That's great. And I know you touched upon the different industries, and I'm actually quite curious to know what industries have you seen are at the cutting edge of using open source and almost ahead? And then also on the other side of the spectrum, what industries are considered behind when it comes to using open source?
That's an excellent question. And as the concept of open source gets more and more understood and accepted, some of the benefits are clear. And one of them we mentioned always is that because it's all open source, so a lot of restrictions or intellectual property laws and the rules that companies may impose all disappear. So there are definitely downside on that, but the benefit of it is that all of a sudden the innovation happens so much faster, right?
Yeah.
And so you will see that in cutting edge areas, especially I think today we think of as AI research or machine learning or deep learning research. A great example of that, because this whole field happens so quickly, involving so many people, so many ideas coming from very, very different backgrounds, from sort of like biology to all the way to psychology to computer science to engineering to commerce, financial systems. All of that can combine together, and it's really hard to maintain the old silos or the traditional way of doing things. So whoever open up tend to get ahead. And that's the benefit of open source. And I think these are the areas where people tend to push this a lot faster. Older industries, like we mentioned, telecom, and in some way, IoT, which are essentially embedded devices, these tend to be more fragmented in the past, and you have small segments of a market tend to use incompatible solutions. That's partly, I think, historical, partly because the engineering involved into the hardware system has to be, in a way, handcrafted for specific use. And so the porting and all that is harder. But all that is also changing today. Linux is very dominant. Really, we're all using some flavor of Linux in a way. And so there's a good hope that this wave of more consistent and open software would be able to actually help those industries as well.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we definitely are advocates in terms of progressing open source forward. And it's great to hear your perspective, especially in an industry like telecoms, which I think historically is a bit behind when it comes to technology, but it's good to hear that they're getting on top of that now. Just on a similar note, what is an area of open source that you're actually most excited about?
Yeah, I very much want to talk about this. And the most exciting thing I think is happening is the work Trust over IP Foundation is doing. Not just this particular foundation, but all the other communities and organizations around the same effort, which is to establish trust on the internet and all the digital systems we use today. So this goes really to the very beginning of designing the internet. If you go back to as early as 70s, maybe 80s, when the initial internet protocol, the protocol set we know as TCP/IP was designed, and there's a bunch of principles the initial researchers and engineers followed. And unfortunately, trust is not one of those principles. We talk about maybe openness, like how everybody can be part of it. We talk about scalability, how this can expand to the whole globe and everybody be able to, all that sort of things worked out fantastically, really nice. Worked beyond people's imaginations. But unfortunately, trust was not built into that. And so the early day of the internet is based on people who know each other. You're all from universities and or a few government labs, and it's assuming that everybody has good intention, everything will work out well. So those assumptions has not turned out as well. And what we noticed is that a lot of things we may not directly connect to that decision, but all the kind of things like fake news or social media issues, and data loss or breaches of huge of our private information, to hacking, to even things like have to remember so many passwords, and all that is essentially rooted on this lack of trust as a foundational building block of the internet. So there's a group of organizations and a lot of people really involved that trying to solve this problem based on a set of ideas that we think can really add trust back into internet and all the digital things, services that we'll use today. So Trust Over IP is an organization I personally involved. It was newly created within Linux Foundation. It's we launched back in June,
Wow.
just days ago, really. And but I believe we within a month of time, we passed more than 100 member organizations and people in
That's
this.
awesome.
So there are huge big interest in this. I'm really excited, and it is a very general. It's something I think everybody would feel the need. You don't need to have really technical background. If you stay anytime online, you will experience the problem of this lack of trust in the system. And so we hope this is a really good opportunity for open source to again rally all the people from different industry background, work on the same thing and solve this problem.
Yeah, I think what I'll be really interested in, and I know we've had this conversation prior to this podcast, but I would really like for those listening, what are some of the examples of situations in real life that raise this awareness of trust over IP? If you could give some concrete example. I know we've mentioned from e-commerce to social media, all the way to even like smart devices in our homes. It would be really great for the audience to know really, some concrete example of what that actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can look at a few examples. And one of them we mentioned is sort of like have to remember many of the passwords. This is essentially a problem of identity. So in our how should we put it, physical life, real life, you carry identity with you. So a driver license or a passport, depending on the use case. And this identity, now we are able to see face to face, and there's many ways that we eventually get used to, and we have some basic level of trust that a person is who he or she say is. And so that fundamental level of trust is what we can then deal with our day-to-day life very comfortably. And in the digital world, that disappears. And so what we end up with is a lot of a patchwork, and this patchwork eventually becomes this password we remember. So the technical solution when people come up with to solve sort of an identity problem was known as PKI. So these are public key infrastructure. It's a set of cryptology that we can use digitally to verify who owns what. And specifically in our day-to-day life will be the websites. So these websites have these certificates that's issued, and you can mathematically prove that when I go visit Amazon.com, it is actually truly a website that's being maintained by Amazon, not a yeah, so that's very important. Unfortunately, we don't do that for each individual. So we cannot, including Amazon, for example, if I log into that or if I access Amazon, they don't know who I am. I have no way to know. The only way is this account ID and password. But that is very problematic because those numbers are very easily lost. It's very easy to hack and get those information. And so you can see the mechanism on the two sides of the conversation are not the same. And the primary reason, I think, is because we designed this system to really, it's kind of heavy. So in the early days, people thought, well, you can only do that sort of thing for a whole website, not into any individuals. And also there's no one sort of who's going to give that. So, we have a government that give out a identify, but who is the government in the internet to give out the ID? So those are the issues you can see sort of technically why this didn't happen. And there are many other reasons. It could be the large corporations like Amazon and Google, for example, would prefer you stick with them because it's also a way to sort of like keep a user into as a customer because make it sticky, right? That's the word. Make it sticky. So if you use a Google login all over the place, then you cannot live without it. And it becomes your identity is essentially being outsourced to Google and others. And of course, for them, that's a benefit, and they would like to keep it that way. But there's a downside to that as well, and that's our digital life is really complicated, and you have to keep remembering where you are and how you're doing. I don't think any of us can potentially. We're truly sort of like be aware of all situations. That's why we are always vulnerable, all of us, right? So those are that's one sort of a big example. I mentioned the fake news, and it's essentially if you apply the principle instead of to human to a digital media, a particular movie or anything. And that also have exactly the same issue, and it's scalability issue, the issue of who's issuing the ID for that particular file, so that is authentic. And once that apply to like IoT, your mobile phones, your camera, all that. So it is really broad.
That's great.
And I think that's very interesting. And I think you just mentioned a lot of examples from an individual perspective. I think I want to shift gears a little bit and think from a company perspective, right? What are some of the things that companies are doing right now? And you mentioned, right, most companies want their products to be sticky. They want more consumers to be there. And that's why a lot of information can get lacked over the internet, everything from social media to the devices that we bring in our home. And we kind of don't trust them, but we know that they are useful to us. So what I'm trying to think is, what are some of the things that companies on their end, right, can do or are already doing to bring more trust in the products that they put out there?
Yeah, most of the commercial companies have sort of both. One side we mentioned they may like that they make their users more sticky to their service, but on the other hand, I think they do see that these really vulnerabilities in in things like losing the customer's private data to hacking or fake news and all the controversies that it caused. Has a business cost to it, and they see that for in the end, in order to expand their digital services to more customers into more areas, they recognize they need to solve this problem too. I think the challenge of solving this problem is that somebody has to start from somewhere because it's so entangled into everything we do today. And that's why it requires a community sort of approach to solve the problem. I do believe that most of the companies would eventually, in the long run, right, see the benefit of a more decentralized and also much more stronger guarantee of identity and truthfulness in the internet. I think that would eventually make everybody better off, not just for consumers, but for businesses as well.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great. And it's a very important project that you're working on. And it's great that you're working on it too with the Linux Foundation. But I wanted to focus on also another important project, which we discussed previously, and that was LF Edge. So could you please tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly, yes. LF Edge, or Linux Foundation's Edge Foundation, it's another of those examples where I think open source start to branch into a different area. In this case, it's I think people use the word edge, and sometimes IoT, sometimes embedded systems. What we are seeing, a lot of time people use the word edge to sort of in contrast with cloud, which is sort of in our imagination will be large data centers, right? But more and more things are coming closer and closer to so-called the edge of network. And so the examples we tend to think of is really in the network, there's naturally a boundary where the consumer side and the provider side. So where things close to that boundary, we call edge. And that can be our online camera, for example, is an edge device, but it sits in our home. So it will be on the consumer side of the edge, on this side of that boundary. And you may think of it as a wireless base station or antenna that sometimes you can see in your neighborhood, and those will be devices on the other side of the edge. So if you imagine there's an invisible line between the two, that's really where the interface is between a provider who give you the network and also we as a consumer using it. So there are a lot of, like I was mentioned earlier, these industries tend to be very fragmented and specialized. There are good reasons for those, but most of those reasons, I think, slowly they are fading away. And so we think it is the time that we are able to apply a lot of open source software innovation to expand beyond the data center, or the tools and software we build for data center can be expanded in a way to reach these part of our system as well. So it will be bringing efficiency, make the cost go down, make the innovation faster, and a lot of repetitive work like operating systems and monitoring, managing remote devices, and also security and trust that we were talking about earlier can be really implemented in this industry using open source software and make really innovation go a lot faster. So Linux Foundation has worked with many of these open source projects. They existed before, but these projects all focus on somewhat on edge and IoT, and they thought it would be a good idea to have a common home. So all these people working on different part of the problem can then share their ideas and work together. And that's really the beginning of E05. It is about, it's reasonably new as well. So I think it's just under 2 years, I would say.
Okay, wow.
And so I'm very happy to be involved with this project. There are a lot of people from telecom, from people working on logistics, from people working on like a small gadgets we know, from speakers, phones, television. And so all of these eventually can be powered by this open source software, and so that businesses and startups can focus on their value add rather than this baseline software.
That's great.
That's
And
awesome.
I'm curious to know how can companies get involved with either the LF Edge or with the Trust Over IP Foundation?
So most of these organizations are pretty open and welcoming, and this is amazingly true in Trust Over IP, in the sense that because they focus on such a fundamental problem, so the people who join to participate in that organization come from all over the place, not just geographically from every country. There's a huge group of European countries and organizations, but also that they come from all different industries. So we have people who are working on financial. They want to use this trust layer to, for example, to detect, to stop money laundering, for example, and also to give better digital services, payment, and all kinds of banking services for people who, for example, today cannot own a bank account. And so digital service is a great thing. There's a lot of very I think serious consideration on how to make everything identified and safe. You can imagine. So there's a lot of creation and innovation coming from that industry. There's people who work on healthcare and how to provide our digital service in healthcare, but keeping very strong privacy protection. I really like one organization that is based on Africa. They run these digital IDs for like refugee camps. So when you have a refugee camp, sometimes this size of it is almost like a small country. They don't have any identifier, or there's no commerce can happen. So they issue right on the spot IDs for each one of them, so they can have a simple banking service. They can know who is who, and so there are many different people involved, and it's wide open. You can join. Corporations like us do pay a fee to sort of support the activity, but the individuals or nonprofit can join free as well. So it's a great way to do that. LF Edge, on the other hand, you can imagine it's slightly more technical. So people who join tend to have some work or something they devote to that is related to Edge or IoT. Even that is very open, because I know a lot of people play with maybe Raspberry Pi or stuff like that, which we will fit in right there. And so we know there's a one project I want to mention is EdgeX, for example, would help these kind of devices to be able to collect data and statistics out of the device easily. So you would be able to then do your machine learning on your side. There are operating systems that support very lightweight containers. These are very common on the cloud, but on a small teeny little device, you can actually run containers on it, and you can reuse all the tools you already built for your cloud application and to run over there. So these are like wonderful areas. I think it's relatively easy to get into, and so I would really encourage everybody to also check out what they can do, what they benefit from.
That's awesome. That's really great. I've enjoyed hearing the work that you guys are doing at the Linux Foundation. Seems like it's a lot of work that is very meaningful, not just for companies, but for individuals as well. And a lot of the times that is really what matters. So now I really want to just ask a few questions on the practical side. What are some advices that you have for companies wanting to open source their software or get more involved in open source?
Yeah, great question. And this, I got this question a lot. Either a company who wanted to get in to sort of figure out what is open source all about and how they can either participate or benefit from it, or within a company that I work with, that different groups may say, hey, I would like to either use or contribute some code to open source, and how do I go do about that? And so in my role, I give a lot of those advice to many of these both organizations, companies, or product groups within a company. And I think typically what I would like to sort of talk to these groups is first of all, find out what is open source all about. And so I talk a particular way, I think the way we should see open source in three different dimensions. I call 3D open source view, perspective, you can put it that way. And the three dimension is really, one is technology, naturally, and two is legal framework. In the end, open source is about sort of like intellectual property rights and how do we manage them. And the third one is culture, of how the society is seeing these things and how the developer community are seeing these things. And all three things are very important, and they link together and make open source work. So like we mentioned earlier, in the early days of open source, how the early day culture was pretty, I would say, it's a close-knit community, and people really don't, trying to keep code from each other. And then, I don't know whether you've seen, there's a famous, it's kind of a milestone in open source, is the young Bill Gates wrote an open letter about people copying code, and he was quite, I think, pissed that, you guys are stealing my code. Well, I think the facts speak for itself, because we do have yes, one way we want to protect our intellectual property rights. We want to protect our labor. We should be compensated for what we do. On the other hand, we also want to see the technology get the wide adoption, and that's beneficial for us too. And how Bill Gates and Microsoft evolved. This probably we should do it another time. They come, at one point Microsoft was sort of the opponent of open source, but now it's a strong proponent of it. And so it's a very good case study of how we see open source and how it relates to our business goals. So once they sort of understand these three-dimensional background of open source, then we can talk about what is your business goal? What do you want to achieve? And do you have I would imagine if you are in a very stable, narrow industry, you may not want to do too much of open sourcing. That's possible. But most of the industries we deal with are growing, and the technology is getting to more and more of our lives and different part of the economy. And so open source is really powerful, both we mentioned for innovation, because this is just make things happen so quicker, so faster. And also that is good for adoption. It allows a piece of technology be widely available, remove all the barrier of adoption, make them widely available. And you can think of how to, I hate this word, but monetizing it in some other way, right? It could be services, people do that. It could be many, many different ways that this would happen. So I think as a business decision maker, you want to see the pros and cons, and also like what your end goal is. How do you want to get your customer? How do you want to work with the ecosystem? All of us are a party in a broader ecosystem or industry. And so hopefully, I think you will find a way that as many companies do see it today, that open source is not only good for the community, for the whole industry, but also good for your own bottom line as well.
I think that's, companies, it's definitely something like you mentioned Microsoft and the transition and change that they've gone through. It's incredible from calling open source a cancer to now being an open source first company, acquiring GitHub. It really is a very, very interesting story and tale. But I think that's why companies, they're really taking open source seriously now, because they understand it does impact their bottom line. And so on that note, I was wondering, like, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen other companies make when either using or managing open source software?
Yes. So larger companies tend to have a sort of like a open source office of some kind. And the reason I think these kind of organizations are very beneficial and important for a larger company is because precisely that we have multiple aspects of open source. So I mentioned the three, just trying to cover the bases there. You not only need to be a good technologist, sort of understand what a certain open source project, pick any one of those, and TensorFlow, how do you like it? Well, you need to know what it does. You need to know its design, the pros and cons, what is really, good at, and what may not be the perfect. And who's involved. And so you do need to have a very strong, deep technical background to be able to evaluate a technical merit of a project. But you also need to sort of know like the open source governance, intellectual property, what kind of license is being used. Do you care about a particular project, like in this example, or in a way dominated by one big player? Is that a concern to you? You may not be, but you may, right? And also that there are areas about cultural things, how that community work and what kind of a sort of a direction they tend to go when, a compromise is needed, which way they tend to think. So all those are very important. And usually one person can know all of these. So, and also most of the groups or product groups do not have all this knowledge with them. And so an office, in a way, it gives the sort of, you can, give a consulting service in a way to within your organization. So that's one way to do it. Smaller companies, I think there are a lot of really wonderful startups today who really base their entire business on open source software. And I know there's a little bit of a struggling going on right now versus from the classic open source versus the competition coming from cloud vendors who commercialize open source software based on this SaaS model, right? And how to really compete in that new environment. Also, all those are, I think, very important topics, not just for open source. I think what we misunderstand what open source is today by thinking of it as a separate thing. I think you really need to think that open source are so wide spread today, is so fundamental part of our landscape that it should be considered for all businesses in technology at least, or any of the other industries moving that direction.
I couldn't agree more. And definitely after a few of the guests that we've talked on the show, Gil Yehuda, Guy Martin, they've all run open source progress program offices. And they really define it as like the center of excellence for open source. Because if you have an engineering team, the engineering team needs a place to go when they have a question or a problem. So I think that's great. And I think I completely agree with you that they need to separate open source and take it a lot more seriously. But I think that's what everyone's doing today, and it's great. But what's really exciting talking with you and hearing about your background is you've seen open source evolve a lot, and obviously working with the Linux Foundation, you're at the forefront of the open source movement. So I'd really like to know, what are you most excited about with regards to the future of open source?
Yes. So one thing for sure is the term open source even evolved over time as well. But the idea of what is open source or how to make that work is constantly changing. We mentioned sort of a recreation of how do one to tune this thing for open source licensing models, or how to make the business work, etc. I want to suggest that we should again come back to my 3D model, right? We should not just focus on existing framework. We should also take a step back and think about the framework itself. And remember, copyright laws are written by all of us. It's not like somehow somebody know all the answer and give out. We think through this and we fight it over, and that's how we end up with today. I think we should rethink how those laws need to evolve going forward. People, in legal professions also start to think about the patent laws for software, and copyright law itself is sort of an accident using copyright to protect software. And there are huge areas that we haven't really paid attention to. That is the data and data sets and like machine learning models, all of that. And how to regulate or protect those assets. Our private data, for example, is regularly collected, and which we then turn into some kind of model, which eventually is software. So in that sense, we are all writing software. My piece of it, I guess, just by living. And so all of that needs some kind of the intellectual property protection as well, if you may. So how to do that is really important. And I know there are some, people in government, in Congress are thinking about that. People in big corporations think about that. We as individuals, people advocate for privacy, should also think about that. I was reading. I will mention Andrew Yang, who's been talking about this topic, and one of the first politicians, I think, talk about this. And so that's very important. That I know that you may think, well, that's not open source. Yes, it is. That's how we have a community putting our data together for a common good, and we should think about how that community should organize ourselves, govern ourselves, and make it sustainable, and that can benefit it for everyone. So that's, I think, one wonderful area. We saw people who starting to think new way of licensing for data, and also apply that to our day-to-day life in a I think effective way, right? We probably don't want lawyers to get into this too much, but in the end, we needed some kind of a social contract in a way, so to make this work. So that's really exciting. And one way to come back to trust over IP. One way to achieve those is these this new identity system so that we can have a authentic identifier for all these things, ourselves plus our data, digital devices. All these need to have a authentic identifier so that we will have a system who will have provable facts. So the technical word is verifiable credentials. And so for people who are really interested in this, the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, have last year published a pair of a document specifying how to create these identifiers and also making verifiable facts about these entities that are verifiable. Very strong support of the kind of the vision we are thinking about. So I think it's as if we are recreating internet again, and we hope this new one would have much more authenticity. We can trust more, feel a lot safer, and also solve some of these problems we've been discussing today. So I think open source has a lot of role to play, not only giving out the source code, but also a new way of making our ecosystem work and our community work.
Wow, awesome. Well, Wenjing, thank you so much for sharing all these insights with us today, and thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Wenjing.
It's very exciting. You can see there's so many things we can talk about. Hopefully, thank you for inviting me here. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to talk more.
Yeah, definitely. So to those of you listening, if you liked what you listened to today, then please like the video and subscribe to Open Teams YouTube channel. And if you're listening to the podcast, then please leave a review and let us know what you think. Next episode, we will be talking to Hong Fong Deng, the founder of Force Asia and the VP of Open Source Initiative. Stay safe, everyone. And until next time, thanks for listening.